What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 of my favorite recent TRPGs. If you're unaware, TRPGs, or SRPGs as you'll sometimes hear them called, are tactical games, typically speaking turn-based, and as you might imagine, these titles focus on tactics. As such, their combat typically revolves around objectives. Sometimes that is just killing everything, but other times it can be escorting units across a map, defending a point, killing specific enemies, that type of stuff. There are objectives to the combat itself, and as it just so happens, if you enjoy these type of games, 2022 has really been your year. But beyond just 2022, there have also been a lot of really great TRPGs over the last couple of years, which are primarily what I wanted to focus on in this video. Because when you click on a video like this, I think it's a little too easy to expect titles like XCOM releases, Fire Emblem, Final Fantasy Tactics, the usual suspects when you talk about these types of games. But honestly, I think stuff like that is a little too easy, and I wanted to highlight some of my favorite, more recent releases that I've played through and reviewed. Now, to that end, we're going to start this video off with 2 honorable mentions, actually. These are games that I enjoyed quite a bit, but aren't quite on my favorites list for reasons we'll dive into real quick. First up, we have Lost Eidolons. I enjoyed Lost Eidolons quite a bit. It's a great game. If you buy it, I think you'll get your money's worth. However, it's a little light in terms of the actual combat. In total, I think there's like 40-ish combat encounters off the top of my head, and unfortunately you can't really repeat any of those in a convenient manner. You have to replay through the story to see them again, and while what's there is good, I just wish there was an option to participate in more of the combat, because as it stands, it's a very narrative-heavy game, which is a similar situation for my second honorable mention, and that is Triangle Strategy. Triangle Strategy is also very, very heavy on the story, and while it does have a lot of great combat, it unfortunately takes a little too long to get there. Your first run through that game is a little rigid. It's a very on-rails experience, and it takes a little too long, frankly, to get to the good part, where the combat opens up and you can participate in battle after battle and have a lot of fun with the system, but again, just takes too long to get to that point. But with no further ado, let's actually jump into this thing and talk about some of my favorites. First up, we have Warhammer 40k Chaos Gate Daemonhunters, which is an absolute mouthful of a name for an otherwise pretty great game. In this game, we take on the role of the Grey Knights, who are specialist space marines, to keep it rather simple, and naturally, we combat the forces of chaos and a spreading plague. It's our job to investigate and eliminate this, and obviously we do that through turn-based tactical battles. And while it's certainly not a perfect game, I think the over-the-top nature of Warhammer 40k really works well in this type of game because the visuals here are really great, and the tactics system itself is pretty robust. There's a ton of environmental interactivity, allowing you to incorporate the environment into the battle a little bit by destroying it. There are multiple classes of space marines that you can manage and upgrade, who will then have their own abilities. And on top of this, you can also manage your ship, the Baleful Edict, which will give you various powers and buffs to also use in combat. And if all else fails and the plague starts to take everything over, it is possible to use Exterminatus to just straight up destroy a planet. It's a lot of fun. It's got a competent tactical system that manages to separate itself from the typical stuff you'll see here. And while it's certainly not perfect, it's a very enjoyable experience. Personally, I think the UI is a little too cluttered, and the battles themselves can get a bit repetitive as the enemy variety is a little on the light side. But with any luck, a game like this will see an expansion that'll flesh that out a little bit, and then I think it would be a great game. But that brings us to number 2 on the list, and this is Troubleshooter Abandoned Children. This game is massive. The story is likely to take you around 100 hours at least, and then from there, you're free to engage with as much of the content as you want repeatedly. You can replay every single mission. There's tons of side missions to take on. There's an online portion if you'd like to play with or against other people, and the game is just massive. The characters you'll play in the game as are all unique characters. You'll get set individuals, if you will, who all have their own skills. However, they have a few different roles they can kind of lean into. But in the case of a couple of these companions, Troubleshooter actually just gives an entire system to that specific character. One of them has a sort of Pokemon-esque system where they can capture and tame beasts. Another one has a robot building system where they can build and deploy robots in combat, which you can then upgrade, etc. So while Troubleshooter isn't amazing in the story side of things, the actual combat and the sheer amount of content are amazing. And considering the fact that you can regularly pick up Troubleshooter for like less than $20, it's an insane value. And given all the customization that is afforded to characters via the mastery system, there's a ton there to engage with and play around with, and it'll certainly keep you busy. But that brings us to number 3 on the list, and this is actually King Arthur: A Knight's Tale. Now, since I've reviewed this game, they've actually improved it a little bit. They've added even more content to the in-game, as well as fixing the download size, or the install size. If you're unaware, when this game launched, it had like a 120 gigabyte install, which was pretty outrageous. And then since then, they've managed to reduce that to a more reasonable number. I think it was like 40-ish something last I looked. But the main thing I love about the King Arthur game here is the aesthetic of it. It's very grim dark. It feels very gritty. And while it certainly has fantasy elements with the whole King Arthur Knights of the Round Table stuff, it's a game that nonetheless takes itself pretty seriously. Combine this with the wealth of characters you can get, the upgradable base Camelot, and you can have a lot of fun with the tactical system. Though I will say one negative here is that the in-game kind of feels a little restrictive in what's available to you in terms of options, because it kind of feels like you're forced to play a certain way to get by, and the end of it, especially even just on normal, can get incredibly difficult if you're not using like a few specific setups. Or at least that was my experience when I played it previously. But at this point, there's tons of guides and everything to get you through as well. But if you're looking for more of a challenging game, I think King Arthur could probably help you out in that regard. Though, as with any game, there are ways to trivialize that and get around it. But the main things I like here are the aesthetic and the actual challenge that the game provides, which can be a lot of fun to engage with. 4th on our list, we have Expeditions Rome. This one kind of caught me off guard. This wound up being way better than I expected it to be, because when you tell me it's a tactical RPG based on Rome, it kind of sounds like it might be somewhat limiting in what is available to you in terms of the actual combat, because you're pretty much looking at swordsmen and archers back then. But surprisingly enough, they managed to build a system that is both engaging and challenging, at least on higher difficulties. That said, though, that's not even the whole story with Expeditions Rome. You actually kind of act as a stand-in for Julius Caesar for this game, and as such, there are a ton of options available to you. In fact, in some ways, you could consider Expeditions Rome just a straight-up CRPG, as there are tons of choices, consequence, endings. The game can go many different directions, and the tactical combat is really just a piece of it. And in a lot of ways, I think Expeditions Rome can really be used as a hallmark of blending TRPGs and CRPGs, because it does a fantastic job at both. But of all of the games on this list, Expeditions Rome genuinely blew my expectations out of the water. It is a ton of fun, and I really enjoyed it. But that brings us to the last entry on our list, and that is none other than Circus Electrique. This game plays a lot like Darkest Dungeon, if you're familiar with that. However, it does so with a sort of steampunk circus aesthetic to it that I thought was a lot of fun, because as a result the game is a bit more lighthearted than Darkest Dungeon is, of course, and it will see you using all sorts of different circus performers to act as your classes, which you'll then engage in combat with, all while managing your circus and using those same performers to perform actual circus shows, which levels up your circus, which lets you do more stuff with the performers, and it's just a really fun gameplay loop. And combined with the relatively unique concept of, the circus performers and everything. That said, though, like most games, it's not without its faults. It is possible to kind of soft lock yourself towards the end of the game if you're managing your circus somewhat poorly, which is especially noticeable on higher difficulties where it is more difficult to manage your circus and get resources to do everything that you need to do. Nonetheless, though, very fun and unique title. But that is going to do it for today's list. 5 of my favorite recent TRPGs. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. By all means, let me know some of your favorite TRPGs down below, or just any favorite turn-based game you love, really, I suppose. But regardless of all that, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But again, thank you, may you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day.